Chapter 7. Insect and Mite Pests of Ornamental Plants. Learning Objectives. After study of the material in this chapter, you should be able to 1. Tell the difference between damage caused by chewing insects and damage caused by sucking and piercing insects. 2. Recognize characteristic signs of damage caused by common pests of landscape plants. 3. Recognize the most common pests of landscape plants. 4. List 3 alternatives to synthetic insecticides. 5. Name pests that might be controlled by Bt in the caterpillar stage. 6. Name pests that might be controlled by horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps. Terms to know. Horticultural oil. Insecticidal soap. Insect growth regulators. Galls. Honeydew. Sooty mold. Chapter 7. Insect and Mite Pests of Ornamental Plants. At one time or another, the hundreds of different ornamental plants used in landscapes are attacked by hundreds of different insects and mites. Fortunately, only 10 to 12 kinds of insects and mites are common pests in most landscapes. You should be able to recognize these common pests and know when they are likely to appear. Resources listed at the end of this chapter will help you to identify insect and mite pests. In addition, the Cooperative Extension Service provides services and training in pest identification. Controlling insects and mites. Review Basic Principles of Integrated Pest Management and What's the Problem in Chapter 1 for general information on IPM and scouting. Review the information in Chapter 3 on using traps to monitor insects and biological control. Review the information in Chapter 6 about cultural management practices that reduce plant stress and make plants less attractive to pests. Pesticides. To use pesticides successfully, know what pest is present. Know when it is most susceptible to control. Remember that pesticides may not work on all stages. With the azalea caterpillar, for example, eggs may not be killed, but the smaller young caterpillars are easy to control. Read the management recommendations for each pest. Although some insecticides have been removed from the market or their uses have been restricted, many insecticides and miticides remain available for use on ornamental plants. Plant extracts such as pyrethrin and neem seed extract give some control of insect pests. Insect growth regulators prevent pests from hatching or molting properly. Synthetic pesticides include insect growth regulators as well as systemic and contact pesticides. Horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps have a more physical action than other pesticides. When mixed with water and sprayed on pests, oils and soaps coat the pest and kill it. They disrupt the insect's ability to retain moisture and also soak into tiny openings and poison the insect's internal tissues. Horticultural oils are especially useful for control of mites and aphids. Insecticidal soaps are effective for aphid, mite, and whitefly control. Identifying insect and mite pests. The most common insect and mite pests of landscape plants are described in the following sections. These pests are grouped as 1. Chewing insects, 2. Wood-boring insects, 3. Sucking pests, and 4. Gall makers. For each pest, there is a description, an explanation of its life cycle, a summary of the typical damage, and some suggestions for management options, cultural, biological, mechanical, or chemical. Chewing insects. Azalea caterpillar. The azalea caterpillar feeds primarily on azaleas. Young azalea caterpillars are green. When they are about 1/2 inch long, they molt into purple-striped caterpillars. They finally grow to about 2 inches long with black and yellow striped bodies and reddish heads and legs. The moths are light brown with darker brown stripes. Moths have a wingspan of almost 2 inches. Life cycle. Female azalea moths lay up to 100 eggs in masses on a leaf in early summer. Tiny azalea caterpillars hatch and feed together in a group. After the caterpillars mature, they crawl down into the soil to spend the rest of the fall, winter, and spring in the pupa stage. Damage: azalea caterpillars usually completely defoliate one stem or area before moving on to another part of the plant. As the caterpillars mature, they do more and more damage. Management: azalea caterpillars can be shaken from the shrub and trampled. Bacillus thuringiensis, Bt, should give adequate control of young caterpillars, but not older ones. Japanese beetle. The adult Japanese beetle is about 1/2 inch long and metallic green with coppery brown wing covers. Small tufts of white hairs occur at the sides and back. Grubs are white, curled, and have brown heads. Grubs are about 1 inch long with 2 rows of spines that form a V on the underside of the tail end segment. Life cycle: during the summer, females deposit batches of 40 to 60 eggs 2 to 3 inches below the soil surface. They prefer damp soil. In warm, wet summers, eggs hatch in 2 weeks. In extremely dry weather, many eggs and tiny grubs perish. The new grubs feed until cold weather forces them into hibernation. The grubs overwinter in cells about 6 inches below the soil surface. In spring, they move almost to ground level, where they finish feeding and pupate. Peak emergence of adults occurs in July. One generation occurs each year. Damage: the beetles attack the flowers and foliage of many plants. Management: it is not a good idea to spray flowers for Japanese beetle control because pollinators such as honeybees or butterflies may be killed. Japanese beetle traps can do more harm than good because the traps attract more beetles than they catch. Neem extracts repel but do not kill Japanese beetles. A disease of Japanese beetles, milky spore disease, is available as a biological control agent. Milky spore disease spores can be applied when the ground is not frozen, but it makes sense to apply it in early fall when the grubs are near the surface of the soil. Insecticides give adequate control of Japanese beetles, but several applications may be needed for complete control because the adult beetles are present for several weeks each summer. Eastern tent caterpillars. Moths of the eastern tent caterpillar are brown to reddish-brown with 2 pale diagonal lines on the forewing. Eggs are laid in masses around twigs and covered with a foamy secretion that dries into a covering that looks like a brown foam pellet. The black caterpillars are somewhat hairy with gold, white, and blue markings and a white stripe down the back. The caterpillars grow to 2 inches long. The cocoon is about 1 inch long and is spun of white or yellowish-white silk. Life cycle: eastern tent caterpillars hatch, begin to feed, and spin silken webbing in spring just at bud break. They soon weave a tent in a crotch on flowering peach, crabapple, or other related ornamental. As they grow, they spin successive layers on the tent. In good weather, they leave the tent several times each day to feed. In bad weather, the caterpillars remain in the tent. After feeding for about 6 weeks, the caterpillars leave the tent and spin white cocoons on fences, tree bark, buildings, or debris. In early summer, adult moths emerge from the cocoons to mate and lay eggs. The caterpillars develop inside the eggs, but they do not hatch until spring. Damage: small trees may be completely defoliated. The silken tents become filled with caterpillars and frass. Management: eastern tent caterpillars can be controlled by destroying the tents with a stick or brush and discarding the young caterpillars. Bacillus thuringiensis should give adequate control of young caterpillars. Control of older caterpillars may not be needed as most of the damage has already been done by the time the tents are noticed. Fall webworms. The fall webworm caterpillars are hairy and grow to 1 3/8 inches long. Female moths are small and white. Some have black spots. Males moths are small, brown, and hairy with dark wings that become clear with age. Life cycle: fall webworms hatch from groups of up to 900 eggs laid in the spring. After feeding for 4 or 5 weeks, the caterpillars crawl down, spin cocoons and pupate in mulch or soil. In July and August another generation of moths emerges from the cocoons to lay eggs on leaves for the fall generation. Fall webworms overwinter as pupae in cocoons hidden in mulch, litter, and soil. Damage: the new caterpillars spin webbing over leaves at the tips of branches and feed within the webs. The web is enlarged to enclose uneaten leaves until each web may become 2 to 3 feet long. Small trees may be entirely webbed. Fall webworms prefer pecan, persimmon, and sourwood, but also feed on other plants. The webbing is ugly, but their feeding usually does not damage the health of trees. Management: fall webworms can be controlled by destroying the tents and discarding the young caterpillars. Bacillus thuringiensis should give adequate control of young caterpillars, and synthetic pesticides are effective for larger fall webworms. Bagworms. Bagworms are caterpillars that grow from 1/16 inch to almost 2 inches long. The caterpillars are rarely seen because they stay within a silken bag covered with pieces of the plant on which they feed. Female bagworm moths do not have wings or legs. Male moths are small, dark moths with dark wings that soon become clear. Life cycle: winter is spent as eggs, 500 to 1000, inside the mother's bag attached to the plant stem. The new bagworms hatch in May and June and spin downward on silken threads. Although most young worms land on the original host plant, some may be blown for miles on the silk thread. In August, the caterpillars mature and molt into the pupal stage inside a silk bag that they cover with bits of leaves and attach to a twig by a sturdy silk band. During August and September, adult male moths emerge from their bags to mate. After mating, females lay their eggs inside their bags and die. Damage: large numbers of bagworms may cause excessive defoliation and may kill arborvitae and Leland cypress within 1 or 2 seasons. Occasionally, the silk band girdles the twig as the twig enlarges. Management: Leland cypress is very susceptible to bagworms. Choose an alternative tree. To conserve biological control organisms, bagworm bags can be removed by hand during the winter and left outdoors away from the host plant. This allows tiny parasitic wasps that infest some of the bags to escape and attack eggs in other bags on other trees. Discard the bags before any surviving eggs hatch in April. Early in the growing season, Bacillus thuringiensis should give adequate control of young caterpillars. In late July through August, use a synthetic pesticide. Wood-boring insects. The most damaging borers are the southern pine beetle and the Asian ambrosia beetle. Southern pine beetles. Southern pine beetles are about 1/8 inch long, dark brown, cylindrical, and about the thickness of a pencil lead. Life cycle: southern pine beetles become active in the spring about the time dogwoods bloom. Pairs of beetles attack the middle and upper trunk of stressed or damaged yellow pines, especially loblolly. If the tree has sufficient vigor, it exudes pitch, which oozes out the entrance hole onto the bark where it hardens. The beetles maintain a breathing hole, or pitch tube, through the pitch. The pitch tube eventually becomes about the size of a piece of popcorn. Each pair of beetles choose an S-shaped tunnel 1 foot long between the bark and wood. The tunnels crisscross and girdle the tree. Eggs are deposited in niches along these tunnels. Grubs feed just under the bark until they pupate, and the new beetles emerge. The entire life cycle takes from 30 to 40 days, 3 to 5 generations per year. The last brood of the season overwinters in infested trees. Damage: the beetles transmit the blue stain fungus that blocks water transport, kills the tree, and degrades the lumber. Southern pine beetles may become so numerous that they kill up to several hundred acres of pines. Management: once the pitch tubes are noticed on the trunks of pines, it is usually too late to save the tree with pesticides. Infested trees should be cut down and debarked or chipped to kill the developing southern pine beetle eggs and grubs. High-value trees can be protected with pesticides during southern pine beetle outbreaks. Insecticidal barriers only prevent infestations, they do not clean up or rid infested trees of borers. Southern pine beetle treatments must reach and thoroughly soak the upper portion of trees to be effective. In landscapes, removal of infested trees is often the best option. Susceptible pines should be planted at least 25 feet apart. Asian ambrosia beetle. Asian ambrosia beetles are almost 1/8 inch long, blackish-brown, and short-legged. The eggs are oval and almost microscopic. The tiny grubs do not have legs. Life cycle: eggs are laid in deep tunnels bored into the sapwood and heartwood. The young larvae hatch and chew out small egg cradles that radiate like teeth on a comb. The larvae apparently do not eat wood, but feed on a fungus, the ambrosia, that grows on the surface of the wood in the tunnels and egg cradles. The adult beetles have special pouches in which they carry some of the fungi as they colonize new trees. Damage: when ambrosia beetles attack, they bore straight into the sapwood and heartwood of diseased or stressed ornamental hardwood trees and shrubs. These tunnels are sometimes as much as 10 to 12 inches deep in a large tree. Fortunately, the ambrosia fungus is not systemic or highly pathogenic, but large numbers of ambrosia beetles may kill branches or whole plants. Their entry holes can also serve as points of entry for more damaging fungi. Management: do not over-fertilize or overwater small deciduous trees. Provide adequate irrigation in dry weather. The Asian ambrosia beetle attacks many deciduous trees, but seems to prefer plants such as cherries, magnolias, crepemyrtles, and styraxes with stem diameters larger than 1.5 to 2 inches. Very few pesticides are effective for Asian ambrosia beetle control. Contact your local cooperative extension center for control recommendations. Sucking pests. Piercing sucking pests feed by sucking out liquids through tiny, straw-like mouthparts. Aphids. Aphids are slow, fragile insects that vary from 1/16 to 1/4 inch long. They can be black, brown, yellow, red, gray, purple, or green. Aphids may or may not have wings. Their young are smaller than the adults and are always wingless. Aphids are the only insects with structures called cornicles that resemble exhaust pipes sticking out from both sides of the rear. Life cycle: during the growing season, aphids give birth to living young, but many species of aphids overwinter as eggs. Damage: aphids inject saliva into plants as they feed, which may distort future growth. Some aphids transmit plant viruses as well. Aphids excrete a sweet, sticky liquid called honeydew. When aphid numbers are large, honeydew often coats the upper surfaces of leaves and other objects below, making infested plants sticky. Honeydew attracts ants, flies, wasps, and other insects. In addition, dark fungi called sooty molds often grow in honeydew, further defacing plants. Management: naturally occurring predators and parasites often give adequate control of aphids. When lady beetles and lacewings are present with aphids, there is usually no need to spray. Aphids are susceptible to soaps and oils, systemic pesticides are rarely needed. Azalea lace bugs. Azalea lace bugs are about 1/8 inch long and have clear, lacy wings with brown and black markings. Nymphs are almost colorless when they hatch, but soon turn black and spiny. Life cycle: the azalea lace bug usually spends the winter in the egg stage within the leaf tissue, although in moderate winters adults survive and continue to lay eggs. Nymphs hatch in the spring. Both immature and adult lace bugs are found most often on the undersides of leaves of azalea and rhododendron. They lay groups of eggs on the lower surface of leaves, usually along the midrib but completely hidden inside the leaf. Damage: lace bugs cause a blotched or spotted appearance of the upper leaf surface, and they leave behind spots of dark varnish-like excrement on the underside of the leaves. Infested leaves turn pale and may drop off prematurely. Most azaleas are susceptible to lace bugs. Although an attack by azalea lace bugs is not always fatal to azaleas, it can ruin their appearance, and damage done in spring can persist all season. Management: shortly after azaleas bloom, start looking for the first and most damaging generation of lace bug nymphs on the underside of the leaves. Control of this generation is most important for best season-long appearance. A bright red predatory bug, the azalea plant bug, may give some control later in the summer. Light infestations can be adequately controlled with contact insecticides. For high populations, use a systemic insecticide. Armored scales. Armored scales are usually very small insects that secrete a tiny fish scale-like armor under which they grow and reproduce. The armor protects them from some pesticides. Armored scales include euonymus scales, camellia scale, tea scale, white peach scale, and others. Life cycle. Tea scale females have flat, hard, brown armor. The armor is oval or canoe-shaped and is about 1/16 inch long. Male armor is soft, white, and narrow with a ridge down the middle of the top. Each female lays 10 to 15 eggs under her armor. The first stage is a flat, yellow crawler that migrates to the newer leaves and soon settles down to feed. Male tea scales sometimes produce noticeable white fluff under the leaves of camellias and Chinese hollies. Crawlers hatch throughout the year, although less frequently in cold than in warm weather. Damage. Leaves often develop yellow spots where the scales feed, and heavily infested leaves may drop prematurely. Management. Although resistant to most pesticides, armored scales are susceptible to horticultural oils which can be applied throughout the year except when the foliage is new and tender or when plants are under drought stress. Soft scales. Soft scale insects include wax scales, cottony maple scales, and brown soft scales. The body is sometimes covered with flakes of clear wax or with white, sticky wax. Life cycle. Most soft scales start hatching in late May. New nymphs are pale yellow or green and translucent. They feed on stems or along leaf veins. Soft scales that feed on the leaves of deciduous plants crawl to the twigs in late summer where they feed for the rest of the fall, winter, and early spring. Most soft scales overwinter as females. Only one generation occurs each year. Damage. Unlike armored scales, soft scales excrete honeydew. When sooty molds grow on the honeydew, infested plants appear scorched and black. The flowers and leaves of heavily infested plants are usually smaller than normal. Twig dieback may occur. Management. Only the crawlers of soft scales are susceptible to contact pesticides. Wax scales are not susceptible to contact pesticides after the wax covers the insect in late summer. Spider mites. Spider mites are small relatives of insects that resemble very tiny spiders. Spider mite adults are so small that they are barely visible. They spin fine, silk webs. Life cycle. Spider mites hatch from eggs and develop through active and resting stages. In hot weather, spider mites may develop to adulthood and begin laying eggs in just 5 days. Damage. Spider mites feed on plants by piercing and sucking out liquids. A pale spot forms at each place they suck out liquid. After a heavy attack, an entire plant may become yellowed or die, and the mites may completely web over plants. Two-spotted spider mites do most damage during hot, dry weather. Spruce spider mites and the southern red mites are most active in the fall and spring. Their damage slows during the winter, and the mites seem to disappear during hot weather except in the mountains. The spruce spider mite is the most frequently reported pest of junipers, and southern red mites feed on hollies, azaleas, and other broadleaf shrubs. Management. The eggs and resting stages are resistant to pesticides. Horticultural oils control spider mites and conserve natural predators that feed on spider mites. Predators can also be purchased for release onto small plant beds when spider mite populations are high. Gall makers. Gall makers are insects and mites that cause plants to form galls, which are abnormal growths that provide shelter and food for the pest. Galls may form on any part of the plant. Most galls are caused by tiny flies, mites, and wasps. Except for the boxwood leaf miner, most gall makers seem to do no permanent damage to their host plants. Boxwood leaf miners. Life cycle. Boxwood leaf miner adults are orange gall midges about 1/8 inch long. They swarm around or cling to infested boxwoods shortly after new growth has emerged in spring. After laying eggs inside the leaf, the flies die. Tiny, whitish maggots hatch and feed inside the leaf. As they grow, the maggots become bright yellow. Several maggots may develop in a single leaf. Their feeding causes galls that resemble blisters to form on the lower leaf surface. Boxwood leaf miner maggots develop inside these blisters for almost a year. The next spring, the blisters form a thin translucent spot called the window, and the maggots develop into pupae. Fully developed pupae wriggle through the windows and hang down. Soon adult flies emerge from the pupae to begin a new generation. There is one generation per year. Damage: heavily infested boxwoods drop leaves prematurely and become unsightly. Management: boxwood leaf miners do not seem to have effective predators and parasites. The systemic pesticides seem to give the best control, especially when applied to the soil. Late winter is the best time to apply systemic pesticides to the soil under boxwoods. Test your knowledge. 1. Horticultural oils are especially useful for control of which pests? A. Caterpillars. B. Plant bugs and stink bugs. C. Mites, aphids, and armored scales. D. Lace bugs and leaf miners. Answer: C. Mites, aphids, and armored scales. 2. How many generations do Japanese beetles have each year? A. 1. B. 3. C. 5. D. 5 or more, depending on the weather. Answer: A. 1. 3. When is the best time to use insecticides against soft-scale insects? A. During the adult stage when the scales do not move. B. During the crawler stage. C. During the egg stage. D. After the scales are covered with wax. The wax absorbs pesticide. Answer: B. During the crawler stage. 4. Which of the following is a piercing sucking insect? A. Southern pine beetle. B. Aphid. C. Bagworm. D. Leaf miner. Answer: B. Aphid. 5. What is the difference between the webs of eastern tent caterpillars and fall webworm? A. The eastern tent caterpillar makes webs in a tree crotch. The fall webworm makes webs over leaves at the ends of branches. B. The fall webworm makes webs in a tree crotch. The eastern tent caterpillar makes webs over leaves at the ends of branches. C. Fall webworm larvae leave the web to feed. Eastern tent caterpillars do not. D. Eastern tent caterpillars make webs only in conifers. Fall webworms make webs in hardwoods. Answer: A. The eastern tent caterpillar makes webs in a tree crotch. The fall webworm makes webs over leaves at the ends of branches.